Hello, it's Ted Ritzer with the Greening Government Webinar Speaker Series. And that series is a collaboration between my department, Alberta Environment and Parks, the Alberta Climate Change Office, and the Municipal Climate Change Action Center. The goals of the series are to help governments reduce their carbon footprint and to help them grow their green economies. And we are fortunate today to be joined by someone from Red Hat. It wasn't until chatting with Brad Micklea this morning that he informed me that actually there's one of the two co-founders of Red Hat, Bob Young, was actually born and raised in Hamilton, Ontario. He did his undergrad degree at the University of Toronto, and he moved down to the States and founded Red Hat. The other thing that I found, Brad, that I got a chuckle out of was Bob is still quite involved in Canada in that he's the owner of the Hamilton Ticats in the CFL. So, that's right. So today we're joined by Brad Micklea with Red Hat, and it was kind of interesting because I got interested in Red Hat through Todd Wilson, who works with the BC government, and Todd's responsible for their developers exchange, and Todd will be presenting later on at 1 o'clock about how BC Environment uses Red Hat in doing some pretty interesting things related to that ministry. So we're so fortunate today to have Brad Micklea, who was with CodeEnvy but is now with Red Hat after Red Hat acquired CodeEnvy, speaking to us about how you can kind of foster community using open source. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brad Micklea. Thanks so much, Brad.
Thank you, Ted. And thanks everybody for watching live and watching the recording. So just a quick introduction. As Ted said, I came to Red Hat through the CodeEnvy acquisition and am project lead for the Eclipse Che open source project. And that project was donated to the Eclipse Foundation by CodeEnvy about the end of 2015, launched officially in March of 2016. Since in the kind of intervening year, the Eclipse Che project rather grew from essentially a brand new project to having over 4,000 GitHub stars and about 12 million hours of usage. So really quite a strong growth that we were very, very proud of, and that continues to grow very, very well. In fact, it's one of the largest projects within the Eclipse Foundation at this point. Now within Red Hat, I'm running product management for the developer tools business unit. And kind of under that is some of the products that came from CodeEnvy, as well as a number of course, homegrown products. So the question today is kind of what is open source, and how do you kind of harness it and its value, and why do you care? So a lot of people think of open source, and what they hear is a number of different things, and I want to talk a little bit about those. But what you may or may not know is that open source as a software paradigm is really kind of taking over. In about 10 years ago, if you'd gone into most enterprises, they would have been using open source, and they would be using a fair bit, but probably not the majority. Now, I saw a recent stat from, I guess actually not that recent, from the end of last year, that was pointing to over 85% of enterprises now significantly invested in open source. And many, many of those now are in fact favoring open source alternatives to closed sourced kind of proprietary alternatives. And of course, this is good for Red Hat because they're the leader in kind of enterprise supported open source. So knowing that open source is growing, knowing that it is this powerhouse in the market at large, how do you kind of harness it? How do you get the most of it, and how do you kind of bend it to what you need? So when you think of open source, a lot of people think of different things. Some people think, oh, well, this is just code that somebody else can read. And that's partially true. Some people think it's a really friendly license. It's one that allows me to do a lot of things with it without necessarily getting into trouble. And that's also part of it. A lot of people just say, free software, that's awesome, that's all I need to hear. I love it. But it's a lot more than that. In fact, when you really get into it and you start working in open source, what you realize is that open source is community. That's where the strength of it comes from. In the same way that, we're all smarter if we band together and use our collective brain power versus just one person. Blend expertises, blend experiences. That's really the power of open source, is it approaches everything from that perspective of be open, be collaborative, use the best of everybody. And so having open source kind of in your corner, or using open source for your project, can bring a ton of benefit to you. You get, of course, more code, more options. Your code, if it's in the open, will typically get more reviews, which means more eyes on it, more ability to find bugs, to highlight potential problems, or just to have a really good new idea, which brings the more, the greater quality and ultimately more usage. As I said, increasingly individuals and companies are really favoring open source when they've got kind of an A-B choice between closed or open. And when I talk about getting more code or more reviews, the stats on this are pretty incredible, because really it's a ton more. For example, just looking at GitHub, and if you're not familiar with GitHub, this is kind of the central location on the internet where open source projects and communities and developers come together to host their code, share their code, contribute to each other's code. So you can kind of think of it as a bit of social coding. Now, these stats are as of 2016, so they're already nearly a year out of date. But there are over 20 million code repositories on GitHub, 20 million different projects. That community is growing by 5 million users a year. And these are, not just anybody, these are developers. So this is 5 million developers, 5 million people that could be kind of pushing towards the goals that you have. And if you're not familiar with GitHub, there's a concept of a pull request, which is basically the way in which you contribute to an open source project as a developer. It's you taking code that you've written and giving back to the community. And there are, well, at the end of 2016, over 100 million active pull requests in that whole community. So just a mind-boggling amount of passion and work and intelligence going into open source software that can be harnessed. So a lot of people, come to this and they go, wow, okay, so it's open. I can get a big community behind it. I get more reviews. I get more goodness out of all of this. Fantastic. For my next big project, I'm really going to build an open source project. And if I build it, I'm going to get all this goodness. But as we've seen, when you build it, they don't really come. That was just a movie. In reality, it never works that way. Now, the good news is that to build a community is free. You don't need to pay to do this. But it is work. There are things you need to do. Now, where a lot of people fall down is not that they don't have the passion or the willingness to work. It's more that they don't know what to do. So what I want to do with kind of, I guess, the majority of this talk is focus in on the what do you do? You don't need to do everything, of course, that's here. But it's a good palette of things where if you're engaged in an open source project, if you're using an open source project, these are ways that you can contribute to grow the power and the strength and the value of that open source project. If there are those of you watching this that are starting your own open source projects, this is a great way to kind of get them off the ground, get them started, get them rolling, and then grow them and grow them and grow them. Now, most of these things I'm going to talk about, in fact, I think all of the things I'm going to talk about here, we used in Eclipse Che to kind of drive some of that very, very large, very rapid growth. So these are all things that have been proven, that I can say I've directly used and proven. But most of them, if you go and talk to other successful open source projects, you'll hear a lot of the same things. These are really kind of well tested. So if we're looking at building a community, there's really 7 steps to it. And for those of you on the line who are not developers, who maybe just use open source code, I'd like you to look at the rest of this presentation from the kind of lens of, this is how I can help give back. Not everything. If you're not a developer, then sure, some of these things you won't be able to do. But there's a lot that you can do just as a casual user who doesn't know how to write software to help the open source projects which you maybe rely on every day, or that you're going to rely on for a major project. So I said 7 things, there are 9 things. Whoops, I lied. The good news is you get more than I said. Under promise, over deliver. So we're going to talk about focusing on an audience, identifying and refining the value proposition, and then helping the audience find you. That's kind of the first chunk, so to speak, of work that you need to do. I'm going to talk about then kind of how do you make it easy for people to get involved, to experience your project, to be engaged with what you're doing. How do you kind of help out there? And then from the flip side, if you're a user, how do you go and help contribute back into this project which you know and love? And I'm going to kind of end with talking about how do you, once you've kind of got the ball rolling and you've got a set of contributors, you've got a user community, how do you then grow them further and grow them further and grow them further? So kind of 3 general areas. But I want to start with a fundamental that I believe very, very strongly in, that it is far better to have a small number of rabid fans for whatever you're doing than it is to have a huge number of periodic visitors. And I think this is super important because when you look at projects and initiatives out there in the market, and I'm not just talking about software now, I'm talking about nearly everything, there's a very modern focus on quantity. How many likes do I have? How many retweets do I have? How many people read my blog? How many people attended my event? So it becomes these metrics that are very, very, on the plus side, they're objective, but on the downside, all they measure is quantity and not quality. And what I've really seen from working throughout my career, but especially with open source, is that you can have 2 open source communities that are the exact same size. And what's going to drive one to grow versus the other is how engaged and passionate that community is. So in the end, I care more about the level of engagement in a community than I do about the size of the community. And there's lots of different ways to measure this. Just very quickly, I don't go into it in depth in this particular presentation, but it's stuff I'm happy to speak about with folks after. Is, you can look at the number of pull requests is a good indicator, the number of comments on issues, the number of external comments on issues. I know it's people who are kind of outside of just the core maintainer or committer community. These are the kind of metrics you really want to focus on. So yeah, it's good to grow the number of stars. Yes, it's good to grow the number of people using it, but always moderate that with what is the quality of those interactions. All right, so getting into our actual 9 steps. The first one is focus on the audience. A lot of times, again, this is very general, not just about open source software, but just most things that people do in life. There's a very natural and human tendency to focus on your own perspective, your own vision and bias. And so when you think about the value of something, often the person who's built it will say, well, the value is ABC. And they're saying that because when they built it, that's what they wanted to build it for. But very often, when you speak to people who have built successful businesses or projects or anything, they'll talk about the fact that what they thought they were trying to provide in terms of value ended up being different than what everybody else saw as the ultimate value. So make sure that you spend some time talking to the people who first kind of get engaged with you about what they think is so awesome and fantastic about what you're doing. You'll probably be surprised to hear that it's either subtly or importantly different than what you expected. This kind of allows you to get good at speaking to this fan base, being authentic, being open, taking criticism. This is very important in open source because open source is a bit of a wild west. And that's actually one of its greatest strengths, but it's something that you have to harness. You have to be comfortable with the fact that although you've built something and you love it and you think it's beautiful and wonderful, somebody's going to come and say, it's pretty cool, except it stinks because of bang, 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 bang. And instead of getting upset, you've got to be able to kind of take a breath and go, I wonder how many of those things are right. I wonder how many of those things I should fix, and kind of approach it from that analytical perspective. Once you get a little base of people kind of using your stuff, what you then want to do is find out as much as you can about them. And I don't mean this to come out in a creepy way, but the more you know about your audience, the more you know about the people who are using this stuff, the better you're going to be able to focus on providing them value. And I think this is super important for any project, especially a large scale project. When I think of, and I'm not from a government background, but when I think of, a big goal like greening government, that's a huge objective. And there's so many different ways that you could do that and so many different values that can be provided. And it seems super important to me that whatever path you take down that road, that you know who's going to really be affected by this. What are they going to get excited about? What are they going to get scared about? How do I get to know them? How do I get to kind of be able to focus on them? Once you know that audience, and once you've started to get those folks who are kind of talking to you, now you can really start to identify that value. Write down why people should care, and write it down from the perspective of what they get out of it, not so much what you get out of it. Try and get those down into just a couple seconds to say, into a couple sentences. If you need 2 paragraphs to explain the value of what you're done, you're going to lose people. They have short attention spans, a lot of different things going on. Try little variations of that. And then this is the part I love, is you get into the refining of it. So this is where you go out into that audience. And that could be physically, of course, but it can also equally work virtually. Connecting with people over email or Twitter or IRC, or meeting them at a trade show or a conference, or just, over lunch. Maybe they're people within your own department or other departments within the government. And just try, pitch this, use the value prop, and see which ones kind of have people going, yeah, okay. And which ones they go, oh, wait a second, that's very cool. Well, I could use it for this, and I could do that. And what if those ones that excite that passion, those are your winners. You want to grab that and figure out what words did that, what sentences did that. And then you refine and you refine until you get something nice and tight and powerful, so that the right kind of people see that, read it, and kind of eyes light up. And I say right kind of people because, again, this is part of figuring out your audience. You do have to focus. There is no such thing as a successful project that is successful for everyone. It's never going to happen. So you got to know who are the people that you're doing this for, and what goodness is it going to bring to them, and be aware that there's going to be other people that won't see the goodness. And that's just something you need to deal with. And maybe you deal with it by compartmentalizing it. Maybe you try and win them over, or maybe they're people that you can just ignore and keep marching. So now you've got an audience, you've got a value proposition, and you've got something that's kind of refined. And at this point, it's still not, I don't know, what's the word, like codified. What you need then is a way to kind of put this down on paper and start to really lock it in. Now, I'm just going to back out of the presentation for 1 second, because not everyone is going to be familiar with what an open source project looks like. So I'm actually on github.com right here, and you can see I'm in a Vertex repo. This is a particularly popular open source project for developers. And this is where all my code lives. So this is how I can go and look at all the code. But very importantly, as I scroll down, I get to something which is called the Readme. And the Readme is almost like the little mini simple web page that every open source project can have. It gives the title of the project and gives you some information on what it's all about. So I can learn what it's about. I can learn how to build it. I can get some examples. I can put anything in here. Whatever I think is going to be of value to my audience, I want to drop into this particular README. So I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but this is a very good example of, whoops, sorry, I'm going to the website. Let me go here. Let me show you what we did for Eclipse Che. So you'll see, this structure is always the same, for example, in GitHub, if that's where you host your open source project. You come down and you see you've got a couple sentences that kind of define what this is, and then read more, which will pop you over to our website. Got some screenshots so people can kind of quickly orient themselves. Okay, looks like an IDE, great. We explain to people how to get started with it, how to customize it, how to contribute back to the project, where to provide feedback, and what the license is. So these are kind of the kind of 5 things that we felt were most important to get across to our user base. But the start of that, you'll see, is that first couple lines. So let's jump back into the presentation here with a little bit of that extra context. So that README, you look at a lot of open source projects, and the README is pretty bare. It might be just the name of the project, or or a couple words. Why is this struggling to load here? There we go. But I think of it as the face of your project. This is what people see. If you're building an open source project, this is where they find you. This is the first thing they're going to look at. So it needs to have that clear value proposition, because they're going to read the first couple lines. If they like what they see, they're going to read more. If they don't, they're probably going to leave. But this is a great place to talk about how to experiment with the project, how to contribute, what the license is, ask them for feedback, watch the issues, maybe link to an FAQ. If you have a website, this is a great place to also link back to your website. So when we were building Eclipse Che, and as we were growing that community, we iterated on this README file a lot. We tweaked it, we played with it, we changed wording, changed organization, which topic areas kind of moved up and down the page. I think that was really important to refine something that worked for our community, that got people involved quickly, that got them engaged, that helped direct them to the right places. So I think this is very, very important for people to look at that. Now, taking things to the next level is, once you've got that really good README, you've got the basis. You've got kind of a landing page for people to come to and start to coalesce, to meet as a community around your open source project. Next thing you need to do is start spreading the word. And there's some neat things that we did for the Eclipse Che project, which were really, I think, different than what a lot of people necessarily think of. So we spent a bunch of time on Quora, for example. If you're not familiar with Quora, it's a site where people post questions and then experts go and file answers. Good answers are voted up, bad answers are voted down. And over time, you get really good answers from really insightful people to a whole wide range of questions. So we found questions on Quora that had to do with our particular value proposition, our particular market. And then we wrote very careful, thoughtful, clear answers and pointed people to our open source project. And over time, those answers got voted up because they were good, because we really were careful with them. We thought through them, we argued about them, then we posted them. This wasn't just quick off-the-cuff stuff. We really wanted those to be strong. We got to a stage where literally thousands of visitors a month to our repository and site were coming from people having found the answers to these questions. Blogs are another huge one. You hear a lot about content marketing. We wrote blogs. We posted them ourselves on our own blog. But even if you don't have your own blog, write them in Medium, which medium.com is a great platform for blogging. Very easy to use. Self-post. You can self-host. You can point people to it. But there's also publications on Medium, and you can kind of submit your Medium blog to other publications on the Medium platform. And it's read by millions of people, every day. So you can write great posts and then submit them to publications which kind of are read by your audience. You can speak at or sponsor a local meetup. Go to meetup.com and you'll be amazed at how many meetups there are in your community probably that relate to the exact topic you're talking about. Get into those meetups, sit in on a couple of them, learn how people present, learn the type of audience and the topic, and then submit a proposal, do a talk, get in front of folks. If you get big enough, you can kind of graduate to setting up your own virtual meetups. We did, for example, at the end of our first year as an open source project, we did CheConf, which was a conference, a virtual conference, all about the Eclipse Che project. And we invited folks from Red Hat, from Docker, from SAP, from Eclipse Source, a number of different companies. And they all spoke at this. Plus, of course, the folks directly involved in the project spoke at it. And we'd originally targeted having 200 people register. and watch. By the end of our, by the time the conference started, we had over 2,000 people registered, and we had 700 people attend live on the day. Many of them, excuse me, several hundred of them stayed right from, what was it, 8 a.m. Eastern? No, sorry, 10 a.m. Eastern until 7 p.m. Eastern when the day finished. So really incredible engagement that you can spark. And doing it isn't that expensive. We use Crowdcast, which does cost a little bit of money, but is a fantastic platform. But Google Hangouts are free if you have a smaller group. And there's lots of other technology to do that. I know here the team's using Zoom, and it seems fantastic. So you can do some investigations, and there's often cheaper or free options there. And last is just, obviously social media. It's a big part of life. Figure out what your audience uses and make sure you talk to them there. But, and I would stress the last part, do try and talk to them. A lot of people have fallen into using social media just as a way to kind of yell out to a large group. And that's good. People need to do that. You need to inform your audience of what's going on by doing those kind of big pushes. But it's important to also engage in conversation. Ask questions on social media related to your project or your passion, and engage in those conversations that come from those questions. That's often the more kind of deep insight that you'll get. And then for bonus points, if you get bigger or more ambitious, then definitely create a site or your own dedicated blog. Market this, track it with analytics. We use Google Analytics. It's free. It does a great job. There's lots of other analytics platforms that are richer, of course. Some of them cost money. But, fill it with high-value content. Make sure that you're providing something through that really gives value to other folks. Connect that back to your repository, your open source repo itself. You can reference the site in that README doc that I talked about. And you can point to the README doc from the site. Make sure you're getting people flowing between these two properties, and then work on kind of marketing both of them, getting people across to both of them. So that's kind of how you can ramp up the marketing around your open source project. Now, at different points, as you're going through a project, you will need help. You will stumble or fall or just kind of get stuck. And one of the things that is probably my favorite thing about open source is just that people are kind of programmed to help. That's really what open source is about. When you think about it, open source software is built by people who never get paid and who do it because they think it's the right thing, they're passionate about it, they want to contribute to something bigger and better than just themselves. And remember that ethos is there. So if you hit a bump, even if it's not technical, even if it's something totally unrelated, ask for help. Share it with that community. Hey, I don't know how to solve this problem. I don't know how to get over this hump. Or, we've got 30 great contributors. How come we haven't seen any in the last 2 months? As a contributor community, what do you think we should do? Just because you start a project or just because you lead a project doesn't mean you have to solve everything yourself. And you'd be amazed that when you ask people to do something, they'll do it. They'll help. One of the ways that we helped grow the visibility of Eclipse Che within the marketplace was as we engaged with people on social media or through GitHub issues or in Stack Overflow or at conferences or wherever we bumped into users in our audience. We'd kind of throw it at the end. Hey, by the way, if you like the project, go into GitHub and hit the little star button. And pretty soon, as we started doing that, because that was one of the things that we thought we should really try and raise the profile, get more stars. And we just asked people, hey, if you like it, hit the star button. If you don't, of course, don't. Instead, tell us why you don't like it. And the minute we started doing that, that star count started going up and up and up and up. And it's just, it's one of those little things. Ask them for what you need, and they will help. Now, this one, I think, is probably one of the most overlooked aspects of most projects that I've seen. The way to make it dead easy for somebody to really kind of experience or experiment with your project. This is not naturally easy when it's software. When you think about it, you have to get the source code for this open source project. You have to get the builder to build the source code. You might have to get a scaffolder to work on the scaffolding. You have to get a web server or some kind of infrastructure. You need to wire it all together. There may be more steps. It just kind of, it's a lot of stuff there. And even for someone who's good at development, that is typically going to take somewhere between half an hour and, let's say, a couple hours. That's a long time to ask somebody to commit before they even see really what you've done. It's a high bar. You know, it's when I go into a restaurant and I want to try something from the menu, it doesn't take me 2 hours before they serve it to me, right? If they did, I'd leave. You got to make it easy for people. You got to make it fast. Now, a couple different ways you can do it is you can add a getting started at the top level of your README, kind of make it nice and prominent, of course. But this is a bit of a shameless plug for Eclipse Che, but we've actually built a mechanism that we call a developer workspace button that can actually be embedded right into that README. And so rather than point this to you in the slides, let's actually just use one. So I'm going to go to this Vertex repo again. You see it has this little button that says developer workspace. So I want to start right away, open our first example. Okay, so I just click this little link, bang, it's going to open up here. Get signed in. And now what it's going to do is it's going to actually take care of all those steps I described for me. So it's actually going to grab the source code, the latest source code from that particular open source project. It's going to create a container for me to work inside. And then it's going to drop an IDE in there so that as a developer, I can look at the code, I can edit the code, I can debug the code. And it's actually going to set up the whole infrastructure so that I can also run it. So I can see what does this actually look like if I interact with it. Not just what does the code look like, but what does the actual application look like. Now, one of the things that is always difficult for computers is trying to do web share and high CPU load. But looks like maybe we got lucky here. All right, so now this is beginning to import that source code. You can see I'm receiving the objects here. I've got to get 21,000 different files in order to pull in this open source project. And I'm at 11,000, 12,000. Okay, this is going a little slow. Again, that's the problem with web sharing at the same time. Oh, there we go. It's gone a little bit faster. Bang, there it is. All right. So now you can see I've got all the source code here. I don't really have to worry about where does it live or do I have space on my machine for it. It's just all here. None of this has been installed on my machine. It's just kind of all there. At the same time, down at the bottom, and I'm actually going to make this a little bit bigger so it's a little easier for folks to see. Excuse me. It's going and it's actually building this whole app for me. So I actually don't know how to build this particular vertical example app, but it's just going to go and do it for me. The folks from that open source community have kind of pre-configured all this to make life easy for me. All right, so build is finished. Now it's deploying. And I think if I click this, yeah. So all that work to see hello world, but you get the idea. It makes it a lot easier. I didn't actually need to configure anything or know how to run anything for me to go ahead and do this. All right, so that's my little quick shameless plug. But I really do, you know, the reason we built it, to be fair, is that we saw this as a huge gap in the community and really felt like, hey, this is something that should be a lot easier. We shouldn't be asking developers to do much more than just click a link in order to experience what my particular open source project does and what it looks like and how they can interact with it. So that was really what we were about it, and still are about at Eclipse Che, is letting anyone, anywhere, kind of contribute to a project without needing to install or configure software. I think that's huge. I still am very passionate about it, as you can tell. So you get 30 seconds to an evaluation versus 30 minutes. And so that's huge. So now let's say you've got all that stuff done. You've got a user now. They've experienced your open source project. They've begun to be engaged. Now, I would say the next most important thing is take the docs seriously. Now, if there are any developers watching this, A lot of developers hate writing docs, and I know it's not the most fun thing in the world. But if you do want your open source project to grow and to grow the community around it, it is so important. The docs are a key area that people interact with. In some cases, they'll interact as much or more with your docs than with your actual code. So host it yourself, take responsibility for it, and treat it kind of like a website. Track it, have goals for it, watch how people interact with it, watch where they leave, watch where they come in, and use it as a way to really, really guide your community. So don't just think of it as, okay, I've got to document this, and then I've got to document that, and then I've got to document that. Think through, how do people interact? What do they want to get out of your software project? So again, I'll just, let's see if I can. Let's take a look at the Eclipse Che docs. So Che is a you saw a kind of a web-based IDE and development framework. And so, we have in our documentation, we want setup to be kind of right up front, because we want to make it super clear and easy for people. How do I get going with this? That's what we want people to do, is start using it, because we find that once people start using it, they really dig it. The next thing is that for us particularly, this concept of a workspace is incredibly powerful. And what we found early on watching people and talking to people about Eclipse Che is that the people who got it and became contributors and got excited were the people who really understood what the workspace model was, what we were kind of doing under the hood. And we found that the people who used it and then kind of went meh and wandered off didn't have a good understanding of workspace. So at first, this workspace administration section was way down here in our docs at the bottom, because it seemed to us like, hey, it's under the hood. So if it's under the hood, stick it at the bottom. But we quickly figured out by, again, being engaged with that community, talking with our audience, no, we got to bring it up. And so we brought it to the front. And that's what I mean by treating this like a website. Think through it, watch how people interact with it, change it, tweak it, all that stuff. So it is work, but it pays off huge. Because this, in many ways, your true users, the folks who are closest to becoming contributors and part of your community, will live longest in your docs. And so the better your docs are, the more likely you are to take those folks from interested to contributing. Speaking of contributing, make the first contribution that people have painless. So again, in Che, we built in a panel to make this easy, because the way that you do a pull request in GitHub is not necessarily super obvious. If you don't want to use Che, then what I would suggest is try and provide documentation to guide somebody through how do you do your first pull request with this repository. There may be rules that your project has. Maybe you have to have them sign an agreement. Maybe you have to have them structure the code in a certain way, or structure the documentation in a certain way. Put that all up front. Make it easy for them to find, so that at least they know what they've got to do. Obviously, I really like the pull request panel as a way to make it easiest. Now, when it comes time to growing the community, so now you've got a great repository, you've got a great project, you know your audience, you're able to talk to them, you can connect with them, you've built up kind of a rapport with them, you've gotten your first set of users, you've graduated some of those folks into being contributors. The community is small still, but it's growing. Now, how do you keep it? How do you keep that momentum rolling? How do you continue that growth from just bringing people on as users to bringing them on as contributors to bringing them on as what we call committers, so people who are now really engaged in this community, and then finally to maintainer. And maintainer is the highest level in an open source community. It's somebody who is kind of signs on to do all the hard work for maintaining an open source project, kind of governing it, policing it, helping users. So they become like an army of founders almost, if you will. So I found that one of the biggest things is, and the easiest thing, is just to make the path clear. Document somewhere that, hey, for this particular project, we want everybody to be able to move from user to contributor to committer to maintainer. That's the path. And so if you love this project, we hope you'll walk that path with us. And then document, what do you need to be at each of these stages. For a contributor, maybe you need a contributor license agreement or a CLA. Make it obvious, make it simple as you can. There's lots of great examples out there. Make it easy for them to find and to do that. What do you need to be a committer? In the case of Eclipse Che, we tried to make it very, very simple and very, very clear. If you get 2 significant pull releases, so contributions, in other words, that are accepted and brought into the primary code base, then you are up to be elected as a committer. And so it's nice and clear. The bar doesn't seem that high, you know, with 2 accepted PRs. But Eclipse Che is a complex product. So for people to do two pull requests, 2 contributions, it does actually take a fair bit of work. So for other projects, you may need to raise that number. You may need to use a different metric. But just be clear about it. Be open about it. And then how do you get from being a committer to a maintainer? And typically that's done by election. And so again, it's best if you can kind of outline, when looking for a committer, we're looking for this, 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 and this. And if you have these attributes and the whole community or a large portion of the community agrees that you do, based on the work that you've done, then it's a meritocracy, and you will, you know, get that maintainer status. And the last point is just that, again, just like asking for help, as you kind of meet people, you know, online typically, who are engaged in some step of this path, find ways to gently encourage them or nudge them towards the next level. So maybe you've got a user and you see that they're commenting a lot on things, but they haven't contributed any code yet. You know, encourage them. Say, hey, you know, it'd be great if you could write that piece of code. And if you're not sure, here's what you need to do that. And if you'd like some help, I can help you with that. You know, but kind of nudge them along the path. When they get to the you know, contributor level, help them understand that, hey, you know, you did one great contribution. If you do a second one, you can actually get to be a committer. And just kind of put that carrot out there for them. Make sure that they know how close they are to that next level to keep them rolling forward. Now, last thing, I'm just looking at my watch. Yeah, we're still doing good on time. Is to support and cultivate the community. And this is another big, big one. I think that this should apply to all portions of life, but certainly to open source software. For me, I try and do this with everything I do. Do it transparently. Be open about what you're trying to accomplish, where you need people to help, what your goals are, how you're going to get there. And do that planning in the open. Discuss those plans out in your repository. You know, ask for feedback. Take the feedback seriously. Don't be defensive. You know, it's fine to defend a position. It's fine to say, no, you know, I respectfully disagree. Here's why, bang, 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 bang. And take the time necessary to really outline your thinking behind why you're disagreeing. It's not okay to just go, yep, dumb idea, sorry, bye. So, you know, you got to, again, foster and engage with the community. You know, we at Eclipse Che, for example, once we got to a certain size, we began hosting virtual public meetings every couple weeks that everyone was invited to. And on those calls, we talk about what we're doing for the, you know, the next several weeks or months. We discuss, you know, concerns that we have as a project team, but also welcome people to come in and discuss concerns or ideas that they have just as users or as people getting into the community. It really helps create that sense of belonging. So, you know, just engage, engage, engage. And so that's where kind of I'll end, is that building a community is a job that really never stops. And it's hugely rewarding. It's, you know, it's a bit like having a family. It's an enormous amount of work. You're raising these kids, but nothing makes you feel better at the end of the day. And the thing I love about open source is it has a lot of that same kind of feeling to it. You go out there, you put a great idea out, you watch it grow, you help people understand it, you help them contribute to it, you watch it grow some more, you watch people take it in different directions. And sometimes you watch some of those directions and go, oh, that's not where I would have taken it. But you let them try it, because sometimes they take it to somewhere very cool that you would never have expected. And that's happened with Eclipse Che. And so you keep doing that. And it is a nonstop, it's a nonstop job, but it's a really rewarding one. And with that, I will say thank you very much. I hope this was helpful, and that you guys can use it as you move forward in your own projects.
So what I'd ask folks to do is to pose any questions within the online Q&A window. But you know, Brad, what I'm just so pleasantly surprised with the presentation is that I think those 9 steps that you outline, although obviously you've developed them from your experience within the open source community, but honestly, in my opinion, Brad, you could use those for so many different project management. That's essentially a 9-step project management process that includes state-of-the-art tools and the whole mention of kind of like the virtual sort of focus groups. And honestly, it's like this is what's happening in every industry on the planet, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's really interesting you should say that. And let me actually just see if I can show you another example. So we and I approach really most of life this way. This is kind of my blueprint, so to speak. And so I agree with you 1,000%, Ted. But when we were Code Envy, this doesn't seem to want to open up a new tab for me for some reason. Okay, I'm not sure why. All right, so I won't touch it. But when we were Code Envy, we built a market map to talk about containers, if you're familiar with Linux containers, and to kind of outline what does the evolving market around containers look like, what vendors are there, what products are there. And it was something that we needed internally, but again, we thought the whole world would find useful. And we treated it like an open source project. We went and put all the content out on a public repository. So we didn't try and hide it or make it secret or just ours. We put it out there and created kind of our first version. And as part of our first version, we pointed people right back there and said, hey, if you like this, if you think it's wrong, if you want to improve it, if you want to grow it, have a contribution on this particular open source project, and that'll get cycled back into the next iteration of this document. So what the output wasn't a piece of code. The output was just a PDF document. But the way that we gathered it was in a very community-centric way. And it was fantastic. We got so many vendors come forward and say, you guys put me in there and that's cool, but that's not how I would have positioned myself. We think of our product as doing more of this. Great, so we corrected it. Or you forgot this thing, or you forgot that thing, or I found this really cool one. It's an incredibly powerful way to make sure that you're getting, like I said, the best of everyone's experience and knowledge into what you do.
No, I mean, it's such an interesting idea. And what you mentioned as far as the use of sort of the state-of-the-art tools to engage people, Brad, and all of those social media compatible and location independent and all of those ideas, I mean, you guys are leading the world in kind of providing those tools. I mean, obviously, I think those concepts that you identified are broad enough that you could use on a whole bunch of different things, whether it's, like the UK government is looking at their digital transformation strategy, which is, their philosophy of open, whether it's open source, open market, open standards, the list goes on, open data. That was one of the things that was really interesting in this speaker series when Sri Alaprolu with Amazon AWS Internet of Things presented. One of the reasons why I got him to present was I had researched and found that the London, Singapore, and Chicago transit authorities had all opened up their transit data to local developers. And it created this almost like an open source economy type situation.
Yeah, there's incredible things you can do there. And I think that, well, certainly in Canada, but I think, governments in general, this is a big shift for them. And certainly there's a lot of data that you need to be careful of in certain programs that, maybe not as appropriate to make completely open. But I mean, government is meant to be for the people, by the people. And I think that nothing really embraces that or reflects that more completely than this kind of open source approach. And I would love to see, more done in government from this kind of perspective of openness and transparency, and really allowing everyday people not just to communicate through their elected officials and that kind of more known or rigid chain, but to engage more directly with departments on the ground about some of the key changes that are happening in our world and our governments.
Well, it's really interesting that you mentioned that, because some of the folks within the government of Alberta are talking about the Australian idea of citizen juries. And that's exactly what they're doing within Australia. And I know some folks with the city of Edmonton had actually pilot tested it right here in Edmonton, Alberta, which is exactly what you've just said. You know, so I guess I would give folks, one more minute to post some questions. This has been fascinating, though, Brad, because it's a surprise to me that I think your process, while obviously it was created within the open source community, I think it's broad enough to have application in a whole bunch of different industries, including government.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is really, it is, I mean, open source really started more, frankly, as an ethos or a perspective on how to do work and then became a kind of mechanism for building software. It didn't, it wasn't really the other way around. It needed that passion and that belief, that faith in some ways, from a set of people early on to say, there's got to be a better way of doing software. Because when you think about it, until open source came along, which is fairly recently in the world of software development, it was just accepted that the way that you built software was you amassed intellectual property in secret with a group of people who didn't talk to anybody else except each other, and then put greatness out there. And the idea was to create this shroud of mystery around all of it. And that the shroud of mystery would somehow, the deeper the shroud, the more the mystery, the better the product must be. And it really, you can think of, the very first people who really campaigned for open source, how tough that was for them to look at that and just go, no, that's utterly backwards. Let's turn this thing on its head. Let's be completely open. Let's deal with things that way. And I think it's exciting to me to see the degree to which everything has really, like I said, begun to strongly shift away from that proprietary mode and more into this just naturally open, transparent world.
Well, Brad, this I know that Todd Wilson wanted to watch this, but he had a conflict with meetings. But this has been a wonderful sort of prep for, like you've provided kind of the theory, and Todd Wilson will provide a concrete example at 1 o'clock of the BC government's use within the Developers Exchange, and maybe more specifically, BC Environment's use of Red Hat to do some really interesting things that deliver more value for BC taxpayers.
Yeah, no, I've seen him talk before. I'm looking forward to that talk as well, for sure.
So, Brad, thanks so much for doing this. This was a wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And if people do have questions, they can reach out to me. Oh, I should have put my Twitter. Let me just quickly drop my Twitter on here. I should have done that to begin with. But there you go. It's just at Brad Micklea. So you can reach out, ping me if you have questions, you have ideas, anything.
Well, thanks so much for doing this presentation, Brad.
My pleasure. You have a great day.
Excellent. Take care.